Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Diane Podell. Thank you for attending our Cognitive Systems Institute Group Speaker Series. Today I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Dietterich, who is Distinguished Professor Emeritus and Director of Intelligence Systems Research in the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at Oregon State University. Dietterich is one of the pioneers in the field of machine learning and has authored more than 130 refereed publications and 2 books. His research is motivated by challenging real-world problems with a special focus on ecological science, ecosystem management, and sustainable development. He's the co-PI of the NSF-funded CompSustNet, a 5-year, $10 million effort to develop the discipline of computational sustainability. He is the past president of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. He was the founding president of the International Machine Learning Society. He has been the executive editor of the Journal of Machine Learning, co-founder of the Journal for Machine Learning Research, program chair of AAAI, NIPS, and he's a fellow of the ACM, AAAI, and AAAS. I'm pleased to introduce Tom Dietterich, who will be talking to us today about machine learning for understanding and managing ecosystems. Thanks for being here, Tom, and I'll turn the call over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Diane, and for the invitation, and I look forward to giving this talk today. The work I'm talking about today, of course, is the result of many collaborations, and I'll talk more about these people as we go through the presentation. Let's see. So, of course, the world faces many sustainability challenges, and the ones that I'm going to be focusing on today are mostly species extinctions and invasive species, and to some extent the effect of climate change on these. And so Carla Gomez at Cornell and myself have been pursuing the development of a new sub-area in artificial intelligence and computer science that we call computational sustainability, as Diane mentioned. And I define this as the study of computational methods that can contribute to the sustainable management of the Earth's ecosystems. And those of you who know me know that I love to have frameworks with lots of boxes and so on. I'm not going to go through all these today, but the main idea, the way I view the opportunities for computer science to contribute to sustainability problems is essentially a pipeline that begins with collecting data, and transforming it, of course, in various ways, then fitting models to that data, and then optimizing policies, say management policies, control policies, based on those models. So today I'm going to just focus on 2 steps in this scheme, which is model fitting and policy optimization. So I'll talk about bird migration as a model fitting problem, and then 2 problems that are ecosystem management or control problems. So to get started, let me talk about the BirdCast project. So our project, this is joint with the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology and with a former postdoc of mine, Dan Sheldon, who's now at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Our goal is twofold. We want to help scientists understand bird migration, and we also want to produce short-term bird migration forecasts at, say, 24 and 48 hours into the future. Well, what does it mean to understand bird migration? It turns out that bird migration is poorly understood, partly because it's a phenomenon that takes place over such a large spatial region that even if you had all of the PhD ornithologists in the world out collecting data, you just couldn't collect very much. And so it has, and birds are too small in general to carry tracking devices. So it's been quite a challenge to study it. But some of the scientific questions are things like, as birds migrate, they repeatedly make a decision, should I stay where I am or should I move onward? And what is the basis of their bird decision making? Are they on an absolute time clock? Are there temperatures that they prefer? Do they wait for favorable winds? What about humidity? What about food availability? And so on. So to study these questions, we're making use of 3 different data sources. The biggest one is data from eBird. So this is one of the largest and oldest citizen science projects. Bird watchers go out, daily, weekly, whenever they feel like it, and they fill out a checklist of the birds that they detect when they're out bird watching. And then those checklists, now of course it's all done with apps, are uploaded to ebird.org. And here's a map worldwide showing yellow dots are checklists that were reported on June 1st of this year. And this was only at 4 p.m. we already had almost 11,000 checklists reported. So that's typical for a day, an eBird day. And you can see we have coverage, really very good coverage in the United States and southern Canada, and, you know, and a few other places, England and so on. Lots of voids other places. Unfortunately, my videos are not working, but the second source of data we use is the Doppler weather radar. So it turns out the weather radar, in addition to detecting weather, also detects birds, smoke, dust, and insects, and so on in the sky. So bird migration happens at night for virtually all species. So if this movie were showing, you would see that as the sun sets across the United States, you would get these big blue clouds like this. Those are clouds of birds that are taking off as the sun sets and starting to fly. And so one of the advantages of Doppler radar is we can measure their radial velocity and relative to the radar station, and we can infer their direction and speed from that. Of course, we cannot infer their species, so this is a sum over all the birds. Another source of data is acoustic monitoring. It turns out there's a subgroup of ornithologists and enthusiasts that do their bird watching at night by putting out microphones, and some species give off night flight calls as they're migrating. So our modeling goal is to create a spatial hidden Markov model over the entire U.S. And to explain how things work, imagine that we were just considering one bird. We'll say that the bird is in state I on day T if it is located in cell I on that day. And then what we're really interested in is its transition probability. What's the probability, which I've got written here, that the bird will move from cell I to cell J on the night between day T and day T plus 1. And we will represent this probability in terms of the scientific variables of interest, the wind speed, and so on and so forth. And so I'll denote all of the parameters in our model by capital theta. So a good starting point is to think about simulating the migration of a single bird. So let's assume we actually had a value for theta in our model, and this bird, I don't know if you can see it, is down here in Florida, and we would say that the bird is in cell 4 at time t equals 1. We're going to denote that by n1 of 4 is equal to 1. So that'll be the number of birds in cell 4 on night 1. And now this bird can simulate its first night of flying by drawing a cell j according to this transition probability. And this is equivalent to rolling a dice, so it's a multinomial distribution over all the cells. And we repeat this for t time steps. Now, if we had, so I can, let's say it makes a move into Alabama that night, and then maybe t time steps later, it finds itself in Maine. Now, if we had enough bird watchers, we could find that bird in every night in every cell, and so we'd be able to track its trajectory. And tracking its trajectory, we could then calculate the likelihood of that trajectory according to our model, and we could adjust our model parameters to maximize the likelihood of the observed trajectory. Now, we can do the same thing with a population of birds. So consider a population of capital M birds. Now, for many species, capital M might be many more than 1 million, so very large numbers. Now we can represent the state of the entire population as a vector of n sub t over all of the cells and giving the number of birds at each cell at each day t. And we can do the same thing. For each of these birds, we could simulate its flight by having each bird independently roll a die and decide where to go. And if we had enough bird watchers, we could get a good estimate of this of the state of the system, the number of birds in each cell. And we could compare our simulations with the observations and adjust the parameters in the model until they match. So that's the basic idea, but of course, as I've described it, it's very slow because we have to actually think about each individual bird and simulate its behavior. And when you have billions of birds in total, that's really crazy. So here's where we start doing some interesting computer science. My colleague Dan Sheldon developed a formalism called the collective graphical model. And this is what the model looks like. I'm not going to go through it. The model is appropriate for any problem where you are measuring only counts, but you do not have identified individuals. So it also applies in any kind of anonymized data setting where you're trying to learn about the dynamics of a population, but you only get count data from it. In fact, it doesn't have to be dynamics. It could be any probabilistic model where the only observations are counts, noisy counts. So a lot of the work in our project has been, this collective graphical model really simplifies the computation, but the computation is still a mess. Doing probabilistic inference in the collective graphical model is very expensive. So in our first paper at NIPS 2011, we were able to show a Gibbs sampling algorithm that was guaranteed to get the right answer if you ran it long enough, and we could handle a map that had 4 by 4, 16 grid cells. But if we scale that up to even a small map that's got a 9 by 9 grid cells, you can see that even after spending a fair bit of time, things are not converging very quickly. But in the ensuing years, we've been able to develop improvements of various kinds. So this was based on a convex relaxation of the problem. Then we developed a multivariate Gaussian approximation. Then Dan and his students developed an algorithm called nonlinear belief propagation that's really doing well. And also last year, Andrew McCallum, a couple of students of Andrew McCallum, developed an approximation that's extremely fast, but you'll note it doesn't quite get to 0 over here in its error. So we've made several orders of magnitude speed up in our reasoning algorithms to the point that we can actually fit the model to data. So unfortunately, I can't show you our initial results for ruby-throated hummingbird, but I will describe them to you. So the model is trying to predict the actual migration behavior, the tracks followed by the birds. And in our initial model, what we see is that it does pretty well in February, March, April. Things are going fine. And then in May, and the birds are moving northward from Mexico into the United States and up into the Northeast. And then suddenly in May, many birds come out of Canada and fly south into New England and New York State. And the problem is that there are areas of the continent that are not very well observed, and this model exploits those to basically store birds in those places and pull them out like pulling a rabbit out of a hat to explain the sudden increase in observations that we see in June. So we had to constrain the model because we don't have enough data. We had to constrain it with prior knowledge. And so what we do is we basically specify the times and places where this model is allowed to have any birds at all. And we just tell it, in the wintertime there are no migratory birds in Canada. And so then, if you could see this animation, you would see that it's behaving much better. Of course, from the scientific standpoint, the fitted transition parameters are the things of interest. And so a couple of things that are interesting is that there is a pretty strong coefficient on the absolute time. So for this particular ruby-throated hummingbird, it is paying attention to absolute time. It seems to prefer cooler temperatures. And wind profit is a measure of how well the wind direction is aligned with the direction the bird wants to fly. And so it's definitely waiting for favorable winds, according to this fit. But it's early days still, and we have a lot more work to do to really get some science out of this model. Some of the next steps from the computer science standpoint are to incorporate the other sources of data. So this is a depiction in graphical model language of our model. This is the main hidden Markov model with the birds. This is the observations from eBird. This would be the acoustic observations and the radar observations, and we want to hook those in as well and should give us a lot more precision. Okay, so that's the first project. Now I'm going to spend less time on the next two projects, which are both control or policy optimization problems. So the first one is about invasive species management in river networks. So the tamarisk plant, which is mentioned in the Bible in several places, is a native of the Middle East, but it has now become an invasive plant in the southwestern U.S., particularly in New Mexico, where it's been invading up the Rio Grande River, and it outcompetes native vegetation and human uses of water, and so it's a major problem. And the more general question is, if you have a spatially spreading process of some kind, what's the best way to manage it? And how does that management strategy depend on the nature of the spatial spread? So we developed looked at a mathematical model that was developed at Princeton for the spread of plants in a river network. And a beautiful thing about river networks from a computer science standpoint is that they are binary trees. And so we represent a river network as this binary tree here, and in each edge of the river, we're going to put some number of slots. And each slot can be occupied by, well, it can be empty, it can be occupied by a native plant or by a tamarisk plant. And our management actions at each time step are that we can do nothing in a slot, or we can go in and try to eradicate that tamarisk tree and kill it off, or we can go in and try to plant native plants in the empty slots, or combinations of them, like eradicating the tamarisk and planting a native plant. And so the dynamics look something like this. In each time step, we can have a tree die a natural death. So you'll see that tree should go away there. And then the remaining trees reproduce by making seeds. Hundreds of seeds, not 3, but this is a conceptual diagram. And then these seeds disperse primarily downstream, and they land in some slot. And then they compete to colonize that slot. So these 4 seeds, for instance, we have 2 natives, which are green, and 2 of these invaders, which are gold. And in this case, the tamarisk seeds won the competition. So that's the basic idea. From a probabilistic modeling standpoint, this competition for establishment is really unfortunate, because it means that the state of any one of these slots here depends on the state of all of the other slots in the previous time step. So there's a giant coupling, and this makes inference in this model intractable. So the objective is that we want to minimize the expected discounted costs over the future, infinite horizon future, of the cost of the invasion plus the cost of management. And a big challenge is that we have an annual budget constraint, so we can't treat every edge of the river in every time step. So to find the optimal management policy, we formulate this as a markup decision process, and we solve it by stochastic dynamic programming. That would be value iteration in this case. The problem with value iteration is that we would need to know in explicit form the transition matrix, which says, what's the probability that if the system is in state I, that it would transition to state J when we perform action A. And we don't know T. We can simulate draws from this distribution, but we don't know it precisely. And there are a large number of states, because each one of these states is the state of this entire river network. So there are tens of thousands of states. So what we do instead is we write a simulator, and then we're going to draw Monte Carlo samples from the simulator to estimate the transition probabilities. And this is essentially a reinforcement learning style approach. So we repeatedly use our current policy or our current state of knowledge to choose some state and some management action, and then invoke our simulator to get a draw from the transition probability, and then update our model, then recompute the optimal policy, and repeat this until the policy is converged. So the computer science question we're asking here is, which state and which action should we sample in each iteration? And we developed a heuristic that we call the delta-delta-V heuristic, which is essentially an approximate value of information. It tries to infer which state action pair would be most informative for improving our policy. And we've compared it against the best previous algorithm for this problem, which was developed by a guy named Fichter back in 1995. We capped the number of simulator calls at 10 million, so his algorithm hits that cap a lot, and our method is doing roughly an order of magnitude better. This is a log scale here. And what's along the horizontal axis is 4 sort of benchmark Markov decision processes from the literature and 4 different configurations of our Tamrisk problem. So we can compare the policy that we compute against published rule of thumb policies for invasive species management. And I don't really have time to talk about all these, but the results show that it really pays to actually compute the optimum instead of using these heuristic techniques. So let me now briefly talk about the final project, which is about managing wildland fire. And this one we don't really have results, so this is more of a plea for help or something. So in the Intermountain West, for instance, in eastern Oregon, we have large ponderosa pine forests. And we believe that under natural management of these landscapes, that is, no management, we might see something like this, where frequent ground fires would keep the vegetation on the forest floor, the so-called understory, would keep it under control. So there would just be small plants down here. And then these very tall and very valuable ponderosa pine trees, which are resistant to fire, would look like this. But instead what's happened is in the United States and Canada, fires have been suppressed in the national forests, and so this has led to an accumulation of fuel, and the result has been large catastrophic fires. When it burns with great intensity, kills all the trees, and even oxidizes the soil. And the U.S. spent more than $1 billion last year fighting wildfires, and of course every year some firefighters' lives are lost as well. So we're looking at a simple management question in an area of the Deschutes National Forest in eastern Oregon, which is when fire is ignited by a lightning strike, should we let it burn or should we suppress it? And so we can formulate this as a Markov decision process where at after each ignition we have to make a decision. Should we let this fire burn or should we suppress it? And the big challenge here is, again, the dynamics of the system are not available to us in a closed form, mathematical form. Instead, we have a simulator, in this case an exceedingly expensive simulator. It's a very high fidelity simulator, and so it can take between 5 and 60 minutes to simulate a single fire and its consequences. And we've seen from our previous study that a typical Monte Carlo method requires at least 1 million simulator calls. And so a graduate student who joined the project did this calculation and said, I'm never going to graduate if I need to call the simulator that many times. So our current strategy is to use surrogate modeling instead and to try to optimize against the surrogate model using Bayesian optimization. So we're using the SMAC tool from the group at University of British Columbia, Frank Hutter et al. So I'm going to skip this and wrap up. So, just a summary then. I've talked about 2 different kinds of problems. The first are model fitting problems, and introduce this idea of a collective graphical model for problems where your data take the form of counts of anonymous individuals. And then briefly sketch 2 policy optimization problems, which both involve what we call simulator-defined Markov decision processes, where we have to, the major computation is invoking the simulator to sample from it. And the big challenge is how to deal with very expensive simulations. There are some common threads running through this, and through a lot of these kinds of sustainability problems, is that we're dealing with spatially spreading processes of one kind or another. And so in all cases, we have a dynamical model that is basically the center of attention. In the case where we're learning the model, we were using this collective graphical model technique. In the other cases, we were given simulators from our clients, and our problem was to figure out how to use them efficiently. And so that leads to the computational problems of efficient probabilistic inference in these models, and minimizing the number of calls to expensive simulators. So I will now thank all of my collaborators. So the collective graphical models work, as I mentioned, was led by Dan Sheldon and 2 students from the University of Massachusetts, Akshat Kumar and Tao Sun, in collaboration with a bunch of folks from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The Tamarisk work is joint with Heidi Jo Albers, who's a natural resource economist, her graduate student Kim Hall, my student Majid Talagan, and Mark Crowley, a postdoc now at Waterloo. And the wildfire work is joint with another economist, Claire Montgomery, my student Sean McGregor. Mark Crowley also worked on this project, and Rachel Houtman. And we'll thank the National Science Foundation for their support and answer questions.
Thank you very much, Tom. This is fascinating research, and you can see how this could help with management and policy for things like managing avian flu and maybe the Zika virus, but very interesting work that's very applicable to real-world problems, as you set out to do. So let me ask the audience to please press *1 to unmute your line and ask a question of Tom.
Hey, Tom, Jim Spohr here. Thanks for a great presentation. I'm wondering about other application areas that you can think of. Going back to the bird migration, I'm wondering if you know of any efforts to try to apply this in, human migration, people out of conflict zones or other types of, or students migrating to different universities around the world. Have you seen any applications of similar techniques for dealing with how people migrate?
I haven't seen that. We've also applied it to some problems in fish migration and fish returns, and also to modeling butterflies and moths. But you could easily imagine applying this, say, to traffic, highway traffic, because again, you have anonymous counts at various points in the road network, and then you want to reconstruct the state of the network. You could also imagine applying it to, and Dan has looked a little at this at things like the census data or health statistics, where if you give us noisy counts of the relevant combinations of symptoms and so on, we could fit a model to that data without having to know the identities of any of the people involved.
Okay.
But we do make one critical assumption, that, which is that we can treat this population as all behaving identically. So in the sense of being all IID samples from an underlying distribution. So in particular, you can see that for bird migration, at a very fine scale, this would not make sense, because according to this model, if you see a bunch of birds flying in a flock in the sky, according to our model, they have each individually and independently just decided to be there, and it's just an accident that they form up into this formation. Of course, at the scale we're working at, which is like 50 kilometers square, this is not really a problem. But it was a problem in the fish migration because the fish, as they, like salmon, as they're coming up the river, they seem to coordinate in some way and then sort of form a peloton and go together. And so the model breaks down for that case.
Great. Thank you.
Other questions? Scott, you have a question? Press *1 to unmute your line. Well, I'll capture Scott. Are you there, Scott?
I'm here. Hello, Tom. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I posted a little question in the text chat. I'm curious how your research on bird migration might fit into a developing virtual Earth for STEM research, a kind of Google Street View with maps with Earth, with Open Simulator. If you know of any such, you're exploring quite fascinating data for collective graphical modeling, and in what ways could this fit into a developing evolutionary biological virtual Earth, and do you know of any?
Well, I don't know of any work in that direction, but it's always been a sort of vision of ours that the Weather Channel would put up their bird migration forecast along with the weather forecast, or that you could get Google traffic, but it would be bird traffic instead of cars. So we're very interested in this kind of thing.
Tom, this is Jim. I sent your presentation over to some of our colleagues at the Weather Channel because IBM, I don't know if you know it or not, we bought the Weather Channel.
I do. I'm actually involved in a project I didn't have time to talk about here, which is deploying a weather network in Africa. It's called the Trans-Africa Hydrometeorological Observatory. And IBM actually just recently gave us or signed a contract with us to deploy, 200 weather stations or something. So we're actively collaborating with the folks there. And I'm working on data quality control and hope to be doing more direct collaboration with the folks at the weather company.
Excellent. Thank you.
Wow, that's great. Well, we're out of time for this call. Tom, thank you for an amazing presentation. Audience, thank you for your participation. I will post a discussion on our LinkedIn discussion group about this, and the conversation can continue. Tom, a million thanks for being our presenter today.
You're very welcome.
Bye,
thanks for the great questions.
We'll see you next time, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.